All right. So, hi, my name is Jessica Hammer, and I'm here to talk today about a game I made with my collaborator, Moira Turkington. And Shoshana and I are both going to be addressing the sort of same issue from different directions, which is when you're making games about Jews and World War II, obviously there's the opportunity to communicate and teach people about the Holocaust, but actually we're interested in ways that people can learn about Jews, Jewishness, and Judaism beyond just the genocide that was committed against the Jewish people. And we want to show ways that you can integrate both of these things. So I want to start by talking about this game, Rosenstrasse, and the idea of defining Jewishness in gameplay. And Rosenstrasse is a game that, I'm sorry, it's not advancing. All right, Rosenstrasse is a game that's about Jewish Aryan couples in Berlin from 1933 to 1943. So we're talking about like the erosion of civil rights, culminating in serious danger for these people. And it's a tabletop role-playing game, which means that you're sitting at a table with people potentially that you know, portraying these characters, and you have to make the decisions that they would make in an extremely dangerous and difficult time. And today I want to just talk to you about two of the characters that you can play in this game. And this is a brother-sister pair, Ruth and Isaac. And Ruth and Isaac, as I mentioned, right, Jewish Aryan couples under the Nuremberg race laws. They're both married to non-Jews, ethnic Germans who would be considered, right, I have to say that in air quotes, and they both have children. And it turns out that this situation lets us think a little bit about this idea of who is a Jew. And we define a priori, right? Ruth and Isaac, brother, sister, both Jewish. And Ruth has a child who, by Judaism's matrilineal laws, is Jewish, although her husband is not a Jew. But this also lets us ask, well, what about Isaac and his children, right? Under the matrilineal principles of Judaism, his children would actually require a conversion ceremony to be considered full Jews. The mother is not Jewish. But within the Jewish community, there are actually divergent opinions about whether we must adhere to a matrilineal only principle. And in fact, some denominations of Judaism would say, no, dad's a Jew, you're a Jew, no need to dunk yourself in a basin of water and convert to Judaism. So by this reasoning, right, Isaac's a Jew, one Jewish parent, you've got Jewish children, no worries. And what I got interested in portraying with this game is actually a third way, which is being propounded by a rabbi named Ethan Tucker and some of his colleagues, which is the idea that actually every Jew needs to make a commitment to being Jewish and living a Jewish life, whether it's their mother or their father who is Jewish, and that we can actually start to think about some of the ways that Jews choose Judaism as being a unified approach, right? Different manifestations, but a single approach to what it means to say, actually, you know, maybe I have the option of not being a Jew, but I'm going to choose to do it. And so we explore this in the game in a scene where Isaac is asked to make a choice about his newborn son. His son is born with medical problems that require attention. But at the point in the game where this scene is played, Jews are no longer allowed to seek treatment in German hospitals. Isaac has to choose. Will he register his son as a Jew, or will he retain the not so great protection offered by his son's Aryan mother, right? And in this, we ask you would have to choose if you were playing Isaac. You would have to choose. And every time we play this game, this is an incredibly difficult choice for the player to make. And in asking the player to make this choice, we get them thinking about this idea of what does it mean to commit to Judaism. This situation with Ruth and Isaac also lets us get at the question of who decides about Jewishness, right? So we sort of set up again, a priori, Ruth and Isaac are Jews, but the Nuremberg race laws were not just racist and anti-Semitic, they were also sexist. So Ruth's family is considered an Aryan family because her husband is non-Jewish and men count more than women, right? While on the other hand, Isaac is the man of the house, therefore his family is considered a Jewish family. And we point this up in the game because there is a point in the game where we hand out to the players Jewish stars for those players who would be considered Jewish under the Nuremberg race laws. And they have to sit there and look at each other as these physical stars are being handed out. And at the moment where Isaac is handed a star and Ruth is not handed a star, there's this very powerful illustration of what happens when outsiders' definitions are imposed on Jewishness, right? That they look at each other knowing we are both Jews, and yet only one of us is wearing the star, and we face very different levels of risk to ourselves and our families. I want to close by saying that the idea of outsiders imposing ideas or hypotheses on Jewishness, it's not over, it hasn't stopped, even if it's less drastic than the Nuremberg race laws. And I want to address some of these misconceptions directly because it's important to think about in the context of when you're designing games that represent Jews. And I'm almost about to run into Shoshana's time, so I'm going to go quick, which is you don't have to believe in God to be a Jew. There's a famous Jewish joke where the punchline is, yes, God, no God, time to go say the afternoon prayer, right? You don't have to observe Jewish law to be a Jew. You can be a Jew at the very moment that you are eating a piece of delicious bacon. You don't have to be a scholar of Jewish texts to be a Jew. In fact, there's a movement called Chassidut, which is about connecting to Judaism through song, dance, joy. My grandfather was a Gerer Chassid before his entire family was slaughtered. Jewish culture is not bagels and lox and pastrami. There are diverse Jewish communities around the world, as many as there are Jewish diaspora countries. And Jewish women, specifically, these words say Eshet Chayil, that the negative stereotypes of Jewish women are a dark mirror of our strengths and the ways in which we see Jewish women as heroic that do not match the assumptions that are placed on it from the outside. If you want to hear more about these topics, here's my information. I'm going to turn over to Shoshana 30 seconds ago. Let's just pretend I did that. Thanks, Shoshana.
Let me find your slides. Shoshana Kessock.
Yeah,
Yep,
that's me.
got him. And it's
Sweet.
the downward-facing arrow is the one that's going to move you forward. Yeah.
Can you guys hear me okay? Yes. Okay, so I'm far from the microphone. Thank you so much, Jessica, for setting that up because that's a perfect introduction to what I'm talking about. So my name is Shoshana Kessock. I'm a role-playing game designer. Specifically, I work in tabletop RPGs and live-action role-play games. So I'm really glad that somebody earlier talked a little bit about what LARP is. So it's a perfect introduction to what I'm talking about, which is a game called Keeping the Candles Lit and how it captures the stories of Jewish women in a different light during the Holocaust. So the project that I was invited to work on is called Warbirds. It was an anthology of live-action role-play games about women's stories that were sort of lost during World War II from different parts of the world. And when I was approached to do the job, I said, the thing that I want to talk about is Jewish women's stories, and specifically ones that are not about the traditional stories of the Holocaust. So when we talk about the traditional stories of the Holocaust, what we normally see is stuff like this. We hear, never forget. We see pictures of people looking out through barbed wires, horrific stories. And those are, I want to, be very clear, super important to continue telling. But the idea is that there are so many more stories that encompass the Jewish experience than just these stories of victimization. Specifically, there are tons of stories that you see about women that are about victimization during the Holocaust. But what we don't talk about is the fact that there are stories about women who fought during the Holocaust and women who went out and became partisans in the woods. And that is what my game is specifically about, and in one part. But I wanted to also focus on the fact that fighting is not the only thing that we can talk about when we talk about women who have agency and power throughout history and in stories. We can't necessarily tell every story about let's shoot people in the face to solve a problem. So I wanted to focus on something else about Jewish women. And specifically, I wanted to focus on tradition. Yes, I had to put a fiddler on the roof up there. I'm really sorry. It's going to happen. The importance of Jewish tradition, especially in conjunction with women's stories, is something that was very fascinating to me, because a lot of the traditions of Judaism are passed down from family members to their children as this legacy that is very much organic within families. And so the traditions that I wanted to capture are about the relationships between family members, specifically 3 generations of women. I specifically was raised Orthodox Jewish. This game was very special to me and very personal, because it was based largely on the relationship between my grandmother, my mother, and me, and about how these traditions were passed down together. This is an old song, basically, that I was taught, which is about how important it is to the Sabbath prayers and passing down, lighting the Sabbath candles. It's important enough that it is represented in a lot of our media as a major part of Jewish tradition and culture. And to this day, if you see photos online of women, that's Gal Gadot, by the way, Wonder Woman, as she was on Instagram with her daughter. It is a huge deal between mothers and their daughters to keep the Sabbath candles lit and to pass that down. So that became the centerpiece for this game that I wrote, which is about 3 women partisans, a grandmother, a mother, and a daughter, who are in partisan camp, and they are trying to keep their Jewish traditions while staying alive to get through the Holocaust. Each of them represents sort of a different piece, the grandmother being the most traditional, the mother just trying to deal with the war, and then the daughter basically being the repository of the future. The traditions that we highlighted in the game were not just the Sabbath candles, but it was also many different traditions that were important to Judaism, and they are represented by items that characters can trade in during gameplay for additional resources, so that they can help themselves and people that they care about survive. And it shows that occasionally when you're trying to survive horrors, you sometimes have to leave behind the things that are the most important to you. And it was important to me to make sure that when in a live action role-playing experience, you have the 3 people playing the mother, the grandmother, and the daughter, you also have 2 abstract characters that you will hand these things over to. One that represents the spark of hope for the future, and the other one that represents the war and the horrible deprivations that it can cause. By the end of the game, people will discover what it is that it takes to give up traditions and leave their past behind. So in closing, because we're really hurrying up, I wanted to make sure that women's stories did not necessarily always look like this for women, where agency is taken away, but instead that we remember that fighting was a part of it, but more importantly, that the traditions of our people basically continued forward even through times of trouble. And basically to remember that there's 2 words that we find very important, shamar v'zachar, which means safeguard these stories and remember. Thank you very much. I don't even know if we have time for questions, do we?
Yeah.
It's like
Do we have time for
2 minutes for questions?
One question, or are we?
One question and a very quick answer.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah.
Dude.
So I want to ask you about history and kind of presentism, because they're in both of these pieces. So if we're thinking about drawing out contemporary discussions about issues of identity and agency and things like that, how do you work to try to contextualize them in a historic period that's very different and has very different forces acting upon players in the sense of the people who are living at that time?
Sure.
So what Owen asked is, how do we deal with the tension between representing history in authentic terms, as sort of it, quote unquote, was at the time, versus recognizing that our players are going to be dealing with other ways of thinking, other frameworks, and of course, among other things, they already know what happened, right? They're looking back from the future. In Rosenstrasse, we actually explicitly acknowledge that we don't expect our players to be historians, and we don't think that they're necessarily going to respond to these things exactly the way people would have at the time. And what we're looking to communicate is for them to understand the kinds of really difficult choices that people faced, and for them to bring themselves and their experiences, even knowing that it's not going to be the same. But we're more interested in that kind of transfer. Yeah, the important part about doing it for a live action role play game is to try to find an experiential marker that people can attach to. So specifically in our game, it's about people can understand the relationships between mothers and daughters and transferring traditions in your own families. And I had a lot of conversations with people who said from other cultures that they were able to understand this game because they have that idea of traditions passing down within their own. And then we just include a little bit about the history of the war and these traditions so that people can read that stuff and create the cultural context that they need. But great question. To be continued. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, guys.
I need help getting